Jaina versus Lunara.
The forest fights back.
Knowledge is power.
On the 737 that almost certainly have been involved here. Let's start with the ADS-B transponder and the black boxes, the cockpit voice and flight data recorder. The transponder is, in essence, a radio box that communicates with air traffic control as well as with other aircraft around. And each flight gets issued a specific 4-number identification code from air traffic control, which we pilots then dial into that box. And this code then helps ATC distinguish us from other aircraft. But this transponder also sends out information in the form of automatic dependent surveillance broadcasts, ADS-B. And it's because of that we can follow aircraft on services like Flight Radar 24, for example. Now, the Boeing 737-800 have 2 separate transponders, which typically are switched towards the pilot flying. So, if the captain is flying, transponder number 1 will be used, and if the first officer is flying, transponder number 2. Now, interesting here is that in case of a complete loss of generators, certain systems will continue to work using the 2 onboard batteries, and one of those systems is transponder number 1. Other systems that will also continue to work up to 1 hour after a complete loss of generators are the captain's instrument displays, radio number 1, as well as several different warning systems, but not necessarily external lighting. Remember that. Now, like I mentioned before, the ADS-B transmission from the aircraft stopped working around time 23:58 and 42 seconds, and then both the cockpit voice recorder and the flight data recorder also stopped within about 10 seconds from that. Now, that is very strange, because at least transponder number 1 should continue to work regardless of engines running, as long as the batteries were working properly. But there is of course a possibility that it was the first officer who was pilot flying, in which case the transponder number 2 would just stop. Now, we do know that the pilots made that radio call, declaring emergency and then later asking for a landing on the opposite runway, meaning that some systems were clearly working here. But the interim report doesn't specify if these calls were made before or after the recorder stopped working. So from this point, we are in the dark about what actually happened in the cockpit and what actions that the pilots might have taken. And the sad truth is that without those recorders, it will be very hard to ever know that exactly. But there are still some more details that we can find out if we just understand a few more technical systems here. So first off, we have the flaps. During a go-around, we would, like I mentioned before, start by retracting them from the landing flaps 30 or 40 to 15. Flap 15 is the standard 2-engine go-around flap, and that's why it has a pronounced gate on the flap handle selector. If we're flying a single-engine approach, then flap 15 would be the landing flap, and therefore we would retract the flaps to 1 in a go-around, which is why that's the next gate on the selector. Now, once we've done that first retraction and are climbing away above 400 feet, we would then continue to retract the flaps and accelerate to clean up the aircraft. And the only time that we would wait any longer than that is in case of an engine failure, in which case we would generally wait until we're above about 1,000 feet above the ground before we'd retract from flaps 1 to flaps up. In any case, this means that above about 1,300 feet or so, we would under normal circumstances be flying with a clean aircraft, with all the flaps completely retracted. The reason that I'm mentioning this is because in the videos that we've seen from the Jeju accident, the leading edge flaps seems to be fully retracted, and that would only be the case if the trailing edge flaps are also up. So together, this means that the flaps must have been retracted during the go-around. Now, the flaps are normally using the hydraulic B system for extension and retraction, but if there is no hydraulic power available, well, then the trailing edges can still be extended and retracted using an electric motor, and the leading edges can be extended using the standby hydraulic system. But both of these standby systems require AC power to work. Remember that. Okay, so the next system that we then get to is the landing gear. On the Boeing 737, the landing gear is hydraulically operated using the hydraulic A system. To move it, we have a big gear leveler in the front central panel of the cockpit, and it has 6 indicator lights above it, showing either green, meaning that the gear is down and locked, or red, if the gear is not down and locked with either or both thrust levels retarded to idle and below 800 feet, or if the related gear is in disagreement with the landing gear lever position. There's also a separate independent set of lights in the aft overhead panel showing the same thing, and a green light on any of those panels means that the related gear is down and locked. Now, since the gear extension and retraction is hydraulically operated, there's also a manual extension option that can be used in case of a complete loss of the hydraulic A system. And that manual extension is very simple. It basically consists of physical wires drawn from the gear up locks to the cockpit, and in order to use them, a hatch has to first be opened in the cockpit floor behind the central pedestal, and then each of the 3 handles has to be pulled out until you feel the uplock release. After that, the gear will then free fall down and lock into position using good old gravity. But actually using this manual release system is very rare and really only practiced in the simulator every 3 years or so. So in a state of panic, it might not become immediately obvious that this would be needed, especially since the normal gear lever would still come down when selected. It just wouldn't do anything. And the only way to notice that would be the absence of green lights and the presence of red lights on the indicator panel, potentially also accompanied with a 1-tone landing gear warning below 800 feet. But that warning wouldn't say landing gear like it would on other, more modern aircraft. It would just be a 1-tone. So this then brings us to the hydraulic system, since hydraulics are used to both move the flaps and retract and normally extend the gear. The hydraulic system on the Boeing 737 comprises of 2 separate systems as well as a standby system. There is a lot to say about this, but what's relevant to know in this case is that it's powered by 2 pumps for each system. 1 electric pump and 1 engine-driven pump. There is also a brake pressure accumulator, but that doesn't really make any difference here because the gear was never extended. The engine-driven pumps are, as the name suggests, driven by the respective engines, with the left, engine number 1, providing pressure for the A system, and the right, engine number 2, for the B system. These engine pumps provide the same pressure, but about 6 times the volume of the electric pumps, meaning that if an engine fails, the system operated by the failed engine's hydraulic pump will move slower and still work. But that's providing that there is AC electrical power available, since the electric pumps are using that to function. If there's no engine working and there's no normal AC electric source, well, then there will be no hydraulic power either. And that finally brings us to the electric system. This is quite simple on the 737. There are basically 3 generators available, plus 2 batteries, which can run a certain number of essential systems for a minimum of 60 minutes. Because those batteries are there, the 737 does not have a ram air turbine, RAT, like for example the Airbus A320 has. The 2 normal generators we use are connected to the engines and are providing the aircraft with AC power to all of its different electrical buses during flight, providing that those engines are working. The 3rd generator is the auxiliary power unit, the APU, but that has to be started separately in the air in order to provide power. If all generators would fail, well then the AC standby bus would be fed from the batteries via an inverter, and the battery DC buses will be fed directly from the batteries. But obviously, the amount of systems that can be fed by those are the absolute minimum possible. And that doesn't include the hydraulic pumps, instruments for the FO, the cabin and galley lighting, nor the external lights. What is powered is, like I said before, the number 1 transponder, radio number 1, the captain's instruments, and a lot of other stuff that won't be important for this story, at least as far as we now know. But what all of this means is that unless a generator becomes available, the normal gear extension does not work, the flap extension does not work, the spoilers on the wings doesn't work, the reversers doesn't work, and crucially, neither does the hydraulic actuators for the flight controls. So if all AC power is lost, then the aircraft must be flown using something known as manual reversion. That's where the flight controls are manipulated purely by muscle power by the pilot through wires and pulleys connecting the yoke and the control column directly to the control surfaces. Doing that is very hard work, and it's often slow to get the aircraft to react to the inputs, meaning that it often starts getting into these S-like turns as the inputs are continuously corrected. And on one of those videos that have been taken of this incident, when the aircraft was in final approach, it was indeed flying those kind of small S-turns. But again, that could be caused by other reasons as well.
My hand overflows.
Now, what about the black boxes, the flight data recorder and the cockpit voice recorder? Surely they must be powered by the batteries somehow. And the answer to that is yes, now they are. Since around 2010, new Boeing 737s have been upgraded with the flight data recorder being connected to the battery bus and the cockpit voice recorder having a system known as Recorder Independent Power Supply, RIPS. That system includes its own battery that can supply the recorder with power for up to 10 minutes in case of a complete power failure. But this aircraft was manufactured in 2009, which means that it might not have been equipped with RIPS and this upgrade. So knowing all of that, let's now have a further look at what we know from the interim report as well as what we can see from the videos. The aircraft clearly hit birds. Again, that's confirmed by the interim report and the pilot's initial mayday call. It then started climbing whilst at least one more radio call was made, and around that time, transponder signal, cockpit voice recorder and flight data recorder stopped working. It must have then continued to climb for a while for reasons that I will soon come to, but according to the interim report, it then turned left for an immediate right-hand circuit for the opposite runway, runway 19. A few minutes later, it subsequently landed about 1,200 meters in on the 2,800 meter long runway with the gear and flaps still retracted. The whole landing was captured on camera, and what we can see is that on top of the aircraft landing far in on the runway, the speed was also quite high, which makes sense if the flaps were up, as the clean speed of a 737-800 would be around 200 knots or 370 kilometers per hour. During the landing, the tail of the aircraft can be seen impacting the runway first, followed by the right engine nacelle and then the left. It then continued sliding on the nacelles along what was left of the paved runway, after which it exited the runway and continued at very high speed across the 300 meters of clearway that was still remaining. Finally, the aircraft impacted a concrete wall on which the localizer antenna for the ILS array was mounted. Due to the very high speed, this impact became extremely violent and ended up completely destroying the aircraft. All but 2 people on board was immediately killed, and the 2 survivors were sitting in the aft back part of the aircraft. Again, I want to really emphasize that the interim report did not specify any actions by the 2 pilots, nor any real technical information that could explain why all of this happened. So any given combination of actions and technical malfunctions are still possible. And hopefully the investigators will be able to puzzle this all together, even without the flight recorders. But just to show you how complicated this sequence can be, let me give you some information based on my own experience as a type rating examiner and instructor. In that role, my colleagues and I frequently did something known in my airline as survival training. This consisted of non-graded exercises, meaning that the students that were flying did not receive any type of grades on how they performed. So the idea was to give them real nightmare scenarios in order to see how they reacted, and then debrief those exercises in the simulator, giving some helpful tips on how to think and act if this would ever happen for real. The reason these exercises were not graded was because they combined several faults at once, going outside of what the pilots would be expected to master. But they were always plausible scenarios, and since it was neither pre-briefed nor expected, the crews got a chance to see how they would react, complete with startle factor and everything. Now, one of the scenarios that we did included